Hey, welcome to the Healthful Woman Podcast, the fastest growing podcast in women's health. Today's Monday, December 9th, 2024. Before I get into today's podcast, I wanted to give a little follow-up on last week's podcast, Mailbag number 15. When it first dropped early Monday morning, there was a glitch in the recording where it restarted at about 14 minutes and then cut off at the end. Thanks to all the listeners who reached out to let us know. We did pull that podcast, correct it, and then repost the correct one. So if you didn't notice a thing, no worries. For those of you who still have the incorrect version and you can't seem to find the correct one, it's probably because your phone settings are to download the podcast. That's actually what happened to me. So to get the proper podcast, you can click on the three dots next to that podcast, delete the download so it comes off your phone, and then you can reopen the podcast so it comes straight from the web. You should then get the correct version and enjoy mailbag number 15. Sorry about that. Hopefully today's podcast is going to go a lot smoother. All right, today and next week, I'm joined by Lauren Burstein, who's going to tell her birth story of her twins, Jonah and Ethan, who are about to turn 1 in January. Lauren had a twin pregnancy that was complicated by twin-to-twin transfusion. In honor of the twin story, we're doing this in 2 podcasts. It's a great story, and I'm really happy Lauren agreed to tell it on the podcast. I'm sure you're going to love it. A few reminders. The Unexpected, the book I wrote with Emily Oster, is available wherever you buy books. Second, please continue to send us questions for Mailbag Podcast. Remember, they are for mailbag, not personal medical advice. Thanks for listening. See y'all next week. Welcome to today's episode of Healthful Woman, a podcast designed to explore topics in women's health at all stages of life. I'm your host, Dr. Nathan Fox, an OBGYN and maternal fetal medicine specialist practicing in New York City. At Healthful Woman, I speak with leaders in the field to help you learn more about women's health, pregnancy, and wellness. All right, Lauren, welcome to the podcast. This has been a long time coming.
It has. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. Very grateful to be here, actually.
Oh, well, that's wonderful. We're coming up, I guess by the time this is dropped, we're going to be coming up almost on a year, the birth of your twins.
Yes.
They're what, like 9 months now?
They're 8 months now.
8 months now. Oh yeah, that's right. I should have been able to do the math. 9 minus 1 equals 8. Okay, whatever. I don't do math anymore. That's amazing. And how are they doing?
Thankfully, they're doing so well. I just dropped them off at daycare, actually. And
so you're doing well also.
Doing well, back at work. And I mean, they're just amazing. They're hitting their milestones. They're so happy. They're just the sweetest boys you can imagine. It's a pleasure.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about that pregnancy because it was, for lack of a better term, a wild ride.
Yes.
And, thank God everyone knows now that they're well and everything's okay. So the story is going to end well. But it was pretty exciting, for lack of a better term. And I mean, listen, it's a great story. And I think everyone's going to appreciate hearing it from you. But before we start, tell us, who is Lauren Burstein? Who are you? What's your story? Where do you live? What are you doing? Just so everyone gets a sense of what, who our speaker is today.
Sure. So I live in Teaneck. I'm married. I now have 3 children, and I'm an English teacher. I work at a Jewish high school locally, and I am, that's pretty much who I am.
And coming into this pregnancy, we're going to talk about, you already had your older daughter, Liana. And when was she born?
So she was born in May of 2022. So they're pretty close in age. They're only 19 months apart.
Wow. So 3 kids. Yeah, that's okay.
Happened very fast. I only got married like 3.5 years ago.
Wow. All right. Well, you work quick. It's all good.
Yes.
And how was her pregnancy and delivery? Pretty straightforward?
Yeah. So my pregnancy with Liana was pretty much very straightforward. I delivered her the day before my due date. There were essentially no complications with either the pregnancy or the delivery. She was a nice size, 7 pounds, 14 ounces. And it was honestly a pregnancy I can say a lot of it I really enjoyed. I ran a 5K a week and a half before I gave birth. My husband and I were in the middle of moving. We moved a few weeks after she was born. So the day before I gave birth, I was actually moving boxes from my car into the new house. And I took great joy in the pregnancy. It was actually kind of nice. I was really excited about her birth, and everything thankfully went very smoothly.
And how old was she when you guys decided you wanted to try again?
Yeah, so she was a year old, and we said, okay, we're ready for, number 2. Be nice to have our kids around 2 years apart. So let's go for it.
And then, what happened when you found out you were pregnant?
I found out I was pregnant. It was July of 2023, and Liana was 13 months old. Actually, I found out a little earlier in June. I went to the doctor the first time in July. And at my first ultrasound, my very first one, I was not even 7 weeks pregnant, 6.5 weeks. My OBGYN said, well, I have some news. I see multiple embryos. And I thought, what? Wow, okay. What does that mean? And she said, yeah, I actually see 2 embryos here. And my first thought was just this flash of 3 babies crying. That was just, I thought, I have a 13-month-old, I'm going to have 2 more babies. And oh my goodness, what am I going to do? And I was by myself because with my pregnancy with Liana, it was during COVID, and my husband, Avi, was not allowed into any of my appointments, essentially. So for this first one, I thought, well, I've done the first pregnancy by myself. Let me just do this one by myself too, And so I was alone, and finding out that I was, in fact, pregnant with twins. And it was a little bit dramatic, though, because my doctor said, I see two embryos. I see 1 placenta, but I don't see a dividing membrane between the 2. And at the time, I had no idea what that meant. I asked her, I said, well, what does that mean? And she said, well, if there is no dividing membrane, then this could be a very, very dangerous pregnancy. And I thought, okay. So I'm just trying to process the fact that there's twins, the fact that there's potentially this very, very dangerous pregnancy happening. And it was only 2 weeks later that I found out that there actually was a dividing membrane between the 2.
Right. I remember that very early. Very early, there was a thought that they may be in the same amniotic sac, but it's well known that very early you sometimes can't see that dividing membrane. So we say, wait 2 weeks, come back, we'll take a look. And I think it was pretty clear early on that there was a memory, but we did know very early on that they were identical twins.
Yes, we knew very early on they were identical. There was a shared placenta. And I actually knew very early on about some of the risks associated with one placenta, with a shared placenta pregnancy. That's actually in part because a former colleague of mine who actually was interviewed by you on this podcast, I think I could say her name, Shira Billet.
Yeah, you can. I don't. She's been on the podcast. I don't know why not.
So Shira is a former colleague of mine, and she had actually shared her story with me, I think it was 8 years ago already, when she and I worked together, or 7 years ago. And I remembered hearing about twin-to-twin transfusion syndrome from her. And so when I found out that I was pregnant with twins that were identical, that shared a placenta, I thought, oh, I remember there's this risky potential thing that could occur. I didn't know much about it. I have to really, really be mindful of this thing, So I knew very early, and I think that was actually very helpful for me when I actually ended up having this twin-to-twin transfusion syndrome, because very early on, I did a lot of research into TTTS. I was just cognitively, maybe not emotionally, but very cognitively prepared for this possibility. I knew it was about 15% of shared placenta pregnancies experience this. And so I was very highly aware of this possibility very early on.
It's so interesting that you mentioned that, because in all the, 6,000 meetings we had together in the past year, I don't know if I ever knew that about you and Shira Billet.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
That's so, I guess I'm not surprised, because you used to work in the same place, and she had, obviously she had identical twins, and she had a complication she spoke about, and it was, she had it was a horrible situation. I did not know that was swirling around in the back of your mind the whole time. Do you think you were, because of that, you said you're more prepared, but do you think you were more scared because of how her story played out?
I definitely was nervous, but I think more than being afraid, I think it was helpful because I just remembered, and I remembered she said something about how there were signs of TTTS that she was not aware of, that she wished she had been aware of at the time. And so I thought, okay, obviously there's only so much we can control, but whatever I can control, I'm going to try to control. And whatever I can be prepared for, I'm going to try to be prepared for. So it was really helpful. And I think I did a lot of research. I read a lot. And I knew that, TTTS was most commonly diagnosed between 16 weeks and 26 weeks. And so I was like, okay, that's going to be the really hard part of my pregnancy because that's when I'm going to be really scared. So I didn't expect it to happen to me, but I knew that I would be worried about that possibility very early on.
And then, I guess I know the answer to this question, but when did it happen?
So I was about 18 and a half weeks pregnant. And that was when I went for an ultrasound, and it was at Englewood Hospital. I already had met you at that point, and I wasn't yet diagnosed with TTTS, but the doctor there said to me, listen, you have an imbalance of amniotic fluids between the twins. And that's the first sign that something is, happening that's not good. And he said, your twins are very healthy right now. Their bodies are not affected at all. We're not even into twin transfusion syndrome, but there's such a discrepancy in the fluid. It's possible it's going to turn into twin transfusion syndrome. So I said, okay, I was very scared. I was very nervous. And at that point, I spoke to you and we had a whole conversation about it. And it was decided that I should probably have a consultation at Children's Hospital Philadelphia just to kind of get into their system in case this did turn into twin transfusion syndrome. And at that point, that was when I had scheduled my first meeting with them. So that was last year. That was early October of last year. Right.
And it looked like it was headed in that direction. Again, you never know because sometimes it sort of just stabilizes, but it's a little bit of a, you've got a life, you've got a job, you've got a kid. It's hard to just pick up and go to CHOPS or why don't we like schedule something, get on the books, just they've met you. If it ends up being nothing, all right, you spent a day and it was nothing, but if it ends up being something, you're not scrambling to try to get in there and whatnot. So I think that was wise. In retrospect,
it was wise.
Yeah.
100%. It was wise. I guess it was like a less than 2 week period where we were kind of waiting to see what would happen. I essentially was kind of going back and forth between CHOP and then I'd go to Englewood for monitoring. And it sort of stayed in the same boat. Like it didn't get better. It didn't get worse for this 2 week period. And that may have been the most challenging of the pregnancy, but that was definitely a very anxiety provoking 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Because I felt like I was really just waiting for the shoe to drop.
Yeah.
I was not sure I didn't quite have this syndrome. I was heading in this direction of the syndrome. And not knowing what was going to happen was really, really nerve-wracking.
Yeah.
I didn't know how to express this to my work, which they were extremely understanding of everything. But I was not sure. I kind of said, I have to miss Wednesday, the full day, because I have to go to Philadelphia. But then I'm back the next day. But then I have to go to Englewood Hospital. I have to miss half a day, the day after that or whatever it was. And then just trying to juggle that with just, are my twins going to be okay? What's going to happen here? That was very, very hard for me.
Right. Your work better be understanding because I know all those people. Yeah. So, because if not, I'm knocking down their door. I was like, listen here, bud.
Yeah. No, they were wonderful. And I actually said this, when the twins were born, I said, I thank them because they allowed me to deal with what I needed to deal with without worrying about my job.
Yeah.
And that was huge.
Yeah. I would say, a great percentage of the faculty, has a professional relationship with me. Let's just put it that way. So
yeah.
All right. So you're going back and forth. I remember it was like 2 to 3 times a week we're talking about, getting scanned and this or that.
Yeah. Scans, so many scans. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I essentially what happened was, so it was early October. And then I always mention this is when I tell people my story, it was around the time of October 7th, this terrible tragedy happens in Israel, and I've got family there and obviously tons of, people that I know and obviously just deeply connected to. And it was just this crazy experience of having just this communal tragedy with this personal, challenge at the same time. But I always say, that when this was happening with October 7th and then being at CHOP, I will say that October 7th kind of made me question humanity, but then my experiences with my medical providers really made me sort of embrace humanity again, because they were so kind. Everyone at CHOP at Englewood Hospital, everyone was just so kind to me. And so they were just there to help me. And so in some weird way, having this challenge and this personal thing that I was going through, just having the people who responded to it, and then my family, my friends were all just super supportive of me, that in a way restored this faith in humanity for me.
Wow.
So with this interesting sort of this juxtaposition that was just, it was interesting. It was challenging, but it was in a way, it was nice to have that like support and that faith. But yeah, I had this 2-week period of uncertainty. And then I remember I had an appointment set up with CHOP, one of these within this 2-week period. And I was scheduled to go on a Monday. And I just remember that Saturday and Sunday, I just like something in me knew something was wrong. I felt very like bloated. I kept kind of telling myself, maybe this is digestive or something, but I knew that was a symptom of twin transfusion syndrome. I knew that feeling enlarged and just that sensation could be associated with it. I kept trying to talk myself out of it, but I knew like, well, I'm going to CHOP anyway Monday, so I guess we'll see. But something in me really knew like something was wrong. And when I went, this was now mid-October, I think it was October 16th, actually. I went, and when I had the first scan, and I could just see, and I already had so many scans at that point. So I was pretty well versed in what different measurements meant at that point. And I could just see, the fluid level of baby B was, like less than, it was 0.2 milliliters, something really low. And that baby A had like 12 milliliter, or whatever it was. Yeah. Fluid ounces. I can't remember.
Centimeters. It's a length measurement,
okay.
But yeah.
The length. Okay. So, and I just remember, I was like, oh no, we're in twin transfusion syndrome. And it was hard. It was hard to process that. And then the doctor came in, and she doesn't usually come in during the scans, but I guess she was, seeing it from her computer. And so she came in, Dr. Moldenauer, and she looked at me and she said, I know that you can tell what's going on now. And I said, yeah. And she said, well, I'm prepping you for surgery tomorrow. And I said, okay, this is what's going to happen.
Right. And you knew that this, like, meaning when she was talking about surgery, you knew what it meant. You knew what the treatment, like you knew what was going to be happening.
I knew it. And that was really key. I was really armed with a lot of knowledge. I listened to your podcast with one of the doctors. I'm forgetting her name, from CHOP.
Kalick.
Yeah.
Nala Kalick, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that was so helpful, because it gave me all the information I needed to know about what was going to happen during the procedure, what the procedure does, what happens after the procedure. And I just was able to kind of accept that this was the reality and this was about to happen, because I just knew, because I had all this knowledge already. So I knew what this meant. And honestly, when I told my family, remember I sent a long text to them in my family WhatsApp chat after we got the news that Monday, and my sisters were relieved. They're like, okay, great. So you'll have the surgery. Great. Like, we don't have to like wait anymore to figure out what's going on. Like, this is actually, they were like happy about it. They're like, okay, great. You'll have the surgery and everything will be fine. So it was scary, but in a weird way, it was a little bit of like, okay, like I'm not waiting for this. I was diagnosed with stage 2 twin transfusion syndrome. And the babies, I think both of them had some sort of like cardiac issues at the time, but I was told that the surgery would hopefully repair those issues.
Right. It's also so crazy because you're talking about, you went from not having twin to stage 2 in a matter of a few days. And like, that's just how serious this condition is that it sometimes it's a very slow, you're like a very slow lead up, but then like a switch is flipped and boom. Like, I mean, if you can't wait another week, half week, it's disastrous. It's crazy.
Absolutely. The Wednesday before, I was at Inglewood and it was still that pre-twin to twin state.
Yeah.
And then by Monday it was stage 2. And it's true. It really taught me like you need that constant monitoring, because it does accelerate very, very quickly. But yeah, so it was just amazing that I was able to have the surgery just the next day,
Right. So you went home and then went back the next day.
I did. Yeah. We were debating what should we do. And I said, I really want to go home and see my daughter.
Yeah.
That was really what I wanted to do. And we left, I went home, I got to see her, and we left for Philadelphia the next morning. I live in Teaneck, New Jersey. So we left at 4 a.m. I had to be there at 6 a.m. We left at 4 a.m. and again, really grateful to my family. They were able to come by and take care of my daughter and all that. But in the car ride to CHOP, my husband hadn't listened to your podcast.
I was going to ask, that's 2 hours each way. Good time for podcasts.
So I said, you know what? Let's listen to it now. So I listened to it again, and he listened to it for the first time on the way to surgery. And it was really helpful to listen to it. I really have to say it was really, really helpful.
Cool. Thank you for that. Yeah. Thanks for the plug.
Yeah. Yeah, it was.
So how did the surgery go?
Yeah. So I remember the surgery was actually pretty straightforward. I mean, we got there and there was a little bit of prep and checking and just, scans again, just making sure they had everything, in place. And I remember my husband walked me to the operating room, and there was I think there literally was a line on the floor, like guests or visitors can't go past this line. Like now it's the surgery part. And I remember saying goodbye to him. And that was a very emotional moment because it was like, I felt very supported and by my family and my husband. And then at that point it was like, okay, like I'm the one having surgery. I'm the patient here. And this is now going to be something that I'm going to go through. Like, this is now going to be my journey with these babies and the doctors, of course, and the whole staff. But there was that line that I had to then cross,
Yeah. It's also crazy because from his perspective, there are 3 members of his family crossing that line. It's the operating room. It's crazy when you think about it. 3 people are going in there. And I mean, no one's really, obviously there's always some risk too, but no one's really worried that you're going to get harmed during the surgery, really. But,
right.
But you're having anesthesia and you're having a procedure and you got 2 kids in there. It's crazy.
Absolutely. I think for him, it was also, I think that's when it hit him was that line. When we had to separate, it was well, there's no, he's he can't be there, next to me during the surgery. And so I think for him, that was also the moment that it was, okay, this is happening right now, but, the surgery itself was pretty straightforward. They gave me some sort of anesthetic that didn't completely knock me out. And I knew this ahead of time, again, from your podcast. It didn't completely knock me out, but it really put me in sort of a sort of loopy state, I was mostly aware, but sort of not fully aware of what was happening. And I remember it though. I remember them going in. I don't remember the full thing, but I remember at one point the doctor said, "Oh, wow, here's a bunch of a cluster of them. We got to cauterize these or something." And it was true. And I asked them about it after they had seen a group of 5, I guess, arteries, veins that they had to cauterize.
Yeah.
And they had seen just one here and there. And then all of a sudden they see this big group of them.
Yeah. They're basically burning for, I mean, this, but for our listeners, they're basically, because it's one placenta and they're sort of essentially cauterizing or burning some of the connections between one side of the placenta and the other that's thought to be the culprit in this twin-to-twin transfusion. It's sort of functionally making the one placenta into 2, sort of dividing this one gets this and this one gets that. It's not exactly what happens, but sort of functionally it's what it does, and to sort of prevent there being crossover between the 2 sides. But they have to look for those vessels and then sort of laser them. It's it's pretty cool.
Yeah, it is. It is pretty cool. And it just amazed. I mean, I was just in awe of modern medicine during this whole experience. Now, after this whole experience, it's truly amazing.
Yeah, I mean, without this, the chance that the babies would have survived is I don't want to say zero, but it's close to zero.
Yeah.
When you have stage 2, you're already you're at 19 weeks or whenever it was, 20 weeks, it would have been, it would have been a disaster. So,
yeah.
All right. So you got through the surgery. How long did you stay in Philly after the surgery?
It was just one night I had to sleep in the hospital,
Mm-hmm.
and I was able to go home the next day. They wanted me to stay locally, like in a hotel for a week, just in case I needed to rush back. But I sort of made the case that I had a 16-month-old at home and I really needed to be with her. And I said to them that, there are other hospitals in the area in case I really needed an emergency, but that I could also be on the road to Philly very quickly if I needed to. So they did let me go home after a day. And I essentially had to be on like a modified bed rest.
Mm-hmm.
I was told not to pick up the baby, and I was told not to kind of stress myself out on too long a walk, et cetera, to kind of take it easy, at least for that week. And again, really thankful to my employer because they were very understanding, and I was actually able to Zoom teach during that week, which was, good for my students, I think, but also really good for me to have that continuity with my classes.
You could say who your employer is on the podcast if you want. Yeah, they've been mentioned on the podcast before several times because Mayfall was on.
Okay, got it. Yeah, so the Frisch School in Paramus, they were just amazing. They were so understanding, and yeah, it was tough because I knew essentially after you have the procedure, you get checked the next day. So you stay in the hospital that night. I was checked the next day, and they're not expecting to see any changes that 24 hours later. They just want to make sure the fetuses are, generally okay. They're not expecting, the fluid imbalance to even out at that point. It takes some time. So I was checked the next day, but then I knew that a week later was really when we were going to see if there was any, development, any progress, from the surgery. So I was a bit nervous to see what would happen. And I went back the next week after that, back to CHOP. And at that point, they told me that the fluid was actually evening out, which was fantastic. And they were very happy to see that. But at that point, there were still some cardiac issues that both babies were experiencing. And one baby was experiencing something a little unusual, some tachycardia, baby A. And so that was something they wanted me to really monitor. And they actually prescribed a medication for me to take to help baby A. And so I ended up starting to take this medicine. I took it just for a short period, but I was on this medication. And so it was kind of this odd experience of I had some relief because it seemed like the twin transfusion syndrome was really resolving. But then I was a little nervous about these cardiac things that they were seeing. They were pretty confident that most of them would resolve in the womb, but the tachycardia, they weren't 100% sure what was going on and what led to that. And so that required additional, extra monitoring from pediatric cardiologists. So that was a bit scary also.
Yeah, I remember that was in the 20 to 24 week period. Pretty much, that month after the procedure, and you're going to, doctors all over the place at that time.
Yeah, I ended up, so CHOP, usually they would have released me after a week or two. And I had to be on the bed rest part for about 2 weeks. Some people just a week. For me, it was 2 weeks because of the cardiac stuff that was going on. But they would have really released me. But because of this cardiac piece, they wanted me to stay on board with them for a little bit. And so I was at that point, there was another few week period where I was going back and forth between CHOP. And then I switched over to Mount Sinai to you for the OBGYN piece. And then I was also going to a pediatric cardiologist in Paramus, who was wonderful as well. So I was back to the kind of lots of monitoring. So it was still that period, that those few weeks were still honestly just very anxiety provoking. Even though, again, I was happy with the twin to twin part, but that part was also still tough.
So what I want to do here is you've told your story from getting pregnant, finding out you're having twins, twin transfusion, the treatment, which was successful with some hiccups. And what I want to do is we're going to stop here for this week, and then we're going to pick it up again next week for part 2 of your story to talk about sort of the back half of pregnancy and then the delivery, then looking back. For our listeners, we're going to pick this up again next week. Thank you for listening to the Healthful Woman Podcast. To learn more about our podcast, please visit our website at www.healthfulwoman.com. That's HEALTHFULWOMAN.com. If you have any questions about this podcast or any other topic you would like us to address, please feel free to email us at hw@healthfulwoman.com. Have a great day. The information discussed in Healthful Woman is intended for educational uses only and does not replace medical care from your physician. Healthful Woman is meant to expand your knowledge of women's health and does not replace ongoing care from your regular physician or gynecologist. We encourage you to speak with your doctor about specific diagnoses and treatment options for an effective treatment plan.